Welcome to Zeitgeist Radio, the podcast for music lovers to expand their horizons into new and interesting musical subcultures. I'm your host, Morgan Rowe, founder of the Zeitgeist Academy. Each episode, I interview someone from a different musical community. Zeitgeist means spirit of the times, and my goal is to make that spirit come alive for you and help you appreciate musical communities you may not know much about. Before we get into the episode, head over to zeitgeistacademy.com/radio. You can see episodes and transcripts and also sign up for my newsletter. There's always more to a topic than can be covered in one conversation, so each week I send a deeper dive into something related to the topic. You'll also be able to access the archives to see past content. That's zeitgeist academy.com/radio. My guest today is Brennish Thomson, a musician from Lee, New Hampshire. Brennish, welcome to Zeitgeist Radio.
Hey, how's it going?
It's funny because I have a lot of musicians on here that also do other things, but you are actually like full-time a musician, which is awesome.
Yeah, fundamentally, I was just saying in our preamble, it's going on my headstone, musician.
Musician, I love it. And very interesting niches. This is going to be a very fun conversation. But can we just start out with who you are? Can you give us an overview of who is Brennish Thomson musically?
Yeah, sure. So I've been kind of a musician my whole life, so it's funny to think about it kind of framed like that. But everything I do is kind of music related. I got most of it from my family going back generations and generations. We've been playing music one way or another, a lot of times for fun, but also professionally as well. One of those connections that we just figured out, which is pretty cool, is my great aunt Beth had an all women's group in Salt Lake City. And
Nice.
and just like seeing that it gave me some juice to to keep going here with what I'm doing. But I primarily got music mostly from my father and my grandparents as well. On my dad's side, my grandfather played harmonica growing up and would sing in the house. My grandmother taught herself piano from a player piano in her own home, and then eventually got into banjo, which got my dad into playing banjo and piano and stuff when he was real young. And that same sort of path happened for me. So when I was born, I was going to gigs all the time with my dad. Grow up going to Cayleys in the Irish music kind of world and the Scottish music world. And I know there's some previous episodes here, as I guess, about the Cayley culture and kitchen music and that kind of thing. But yeah, and I got sort of inoculated with the tunes. They were in my head from a young age. I was sprinting around and playing with kids and throwing balls around and stuff. But I was absorbing. When you're that age, you really you get it passively, even if you're not trying to do it. So I kind of got the knack for wanting to be into it, and got a fiddle at 18 months old. There's a bit of a story there. But I can back up a second here. There's video evidence of this. My dad, and actually I'll back up even a little further to explain this side of things. So my dad was a fiddle player for years and years and years. Played in Nashville and did touring and other things. Kind of came to it very really naturally. Essentially, a band was like, "Hey, our guitar player up and left. We need a guitar player. You're a guy. It seemed like you're into doing things here. Come learn guitar with us." And ended up playing with these guys. And that led him down a path of doing music kind of for fun, and then eventually for hire. And that extended about to just before I was born, and he got a neurological condition called focal dystonia. So we do a lot of work with disabilities now because of this. This work, it's a little bit like Parkinson's. So it's a neurological disease, but it doesn't continue to progress through your life. You kind of have it or you don't. And he lost the ability to use his right shoulder. So he was a right-handed player. I can talk a little bit about right and left playing too, because that's something that I focus a lot on. But he lost the ability to play right-handed. He had other instruments that he went and started playing at things. But about when I was born, he decided, okay, I'm going to take another crack at playing the violin, but I'm going to try left-handed this time. Which, for any of us who are not gifted and ambidextrous, it's a really tricky thing to do, to relearn an instrument or do anything write your name with the left hand. So he started learning kind of violin alongside me growing up learning violin. So he would play at my crib and things. So one day he comes over and he's playing by my crib, and I yanked the bow out of his hand. And so yeah, and then the rest is history. So yeah.
So you and the fiddle have been one for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, born in the same hole. Yeah.
Again, I think people can tell it's been very hard to narrow down a single topic for this one episode. We might have to have you back, Brennish. Let's talk about some of this folk music stuff. Sounds like you've been immersed in it your entire life. What was the first kind of memories that you have of folk, and like what made you fall in love with it, and what keeps that love alive?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Folk music is, to me, I talked a little bit at the very beginning about how I grew up with it and how it sort of was intrinsic to my upbringing beyond just actually playing it, being around it, growing up. So, a similar thing kind of extends to how I got into it. I would be along with gigs and I'd be hanging out with friends and things and listening to the tunes. But that music's pretty enchanting, and it's short. When you talk about a lot of music, we're talking really long, complicated pieces with lots of instrumentation. I mean, a lot of modern music is that way. I mean, I can't, half the top 10 singles right now that are popular, I couldn't just make in my room. You need a multi-million-dollar studio, or you have to, maybe you can make them in your bedroom with the right gear and right equipment. But it's, but, the type of music that I grew up listening to was tunes that lasted maybe a minute in length. And it's consumable, right? So I was listening to all this stuff growing up, and the environment that folk music exists in is one that's super, in most ways, very friendly, inclusive. It's something that is like very comfortable feeling, especially having grown up in it myself, but also I think to newcomers as well. And so I just felt kind of at ease. I wanted to play the tunes, It wasn't a matter of somebody, there's no gun to my head saying, play music. You just gotta all of a sudden realize, hey, I've heard this tune enough times, and if I have at least a little bit of proficiency on an instrument, then you can jump right in, and that's kind of the beauty of folk music. So yeah, I got some formal lessons here and there, which really would help with learning how to actually play the instruments themselves. But I think predominantly I got the folk music thing. It just happened the way it's meant to happen, just naturally, through osmosis. So.
Nice. Nice. There's a lot of also different scenes. We've had several people on this podcast even just talking about there's the Irish Ceilidh scene, there's the contra dance scene, there's the performance, like traditional dance and traditional music scene, like performance style. Where do you kind of sit in these? Like, what is your scene? Where are some places that you play? And where do you kind of hang out in this hodgepodge of folk music?
Yeah. So folk music is in a couple different veins. There's folk music in the sense that we're playing just with folks, which is sort of the obvious one, right? So playing at people's houses, or playing in someone's kitchen, which is just like the homey aspect of it, which kind of can even extend to light performance, coffee houses and open mics and things like that. And then there's the other side of it, which is professional folk music and traditional music, which I also grew up in kind of hand in hand. So I spent a lot of time as a kid playing totally casually in settings that were just like, this is, I'm having a good time kind of thing. And it became my social life growing up, was going to music circles and things. You think about what can get people to hang out together. Maybe they have a mutual love of reading, or maybe they like to go have a pint at a pub or something. Those things can all be, there's a lot of different ways to socialize, but socializing with music is a pretty intrinsic thing to it. And it's so satisfying, because it's like, okay, here we are, we're shooting the shot, having a good time. And it's like, oh, we're a little bored. Oh, we know 500 tunes together. We can sit down for hours and just play tunes. So that was an amazing thing growing up, having that, and totally extends today. And then the other side of the coin being professional music. So my dad growing up was a professional musician, and he made his living that way. And he made books about music, and taught and did lessons and that sort of thing, but also performed. So I would be with him at performances from anywhere from, again, someone's living room. They hire you, say it's their grandparents grew up listening to Irish music or Scottish music, and they want a piece of that in their home. So I get to feel that kind of connection, that somebody values what you do, because it means a lot to them, even at a really small scale like that, how important that is, all the way up to larger venues playing in theaters and all the way up to stadiums and things like that. When you play music, I mean, you definitely, with folk music, you feel that connection no matter how big or small it is. And I got into sort of the professional side of it maybe when I was about 8, and started playing gigs. My very first gig on stage, like real gig, was for the fantastic barn dance caller Dudley Loftman here in the East Coast. He's a renowned folk hero to a lot of people, had the National Heritage Award and eventually won the New Hampshire Governor's Award, which my dad and I both won this previous year, the New Hampshire State Governor Award for Folk Heritage. So he was a mentor growing up, having this incredible person who played with small groups of people, but was always very professional. I mean, extremely professional on stage. He's like a good businessman. You got to be a good business person to be a confederate in the scene sort of thing. But he taught me from a young age. Even when I was 8, I came up on stage and I played a pair of wooden spoons on stage for this whole dance. And he came to me afterwards and gave me whatever it was back then, $12, which was like a crazy amount of money, or so. When you're 8 years old, it felt like I was rich. So, but that gave me this the feeling that you can make money doing this. You can live doing this, and it's not just a for fun thing. It's not just, oh, my dad does this cool music thing. Like, oh, you can actually, this can be a path. It's a hard path, but it's something that is like very fulfilling. There's a lot of man hours that go into playing music and performing for people. A lot of which is, seldom seen, by anyone who on the front end of things. But it's as far as the job goes, I'm so blessed, to be in the music scene like this.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, congratulations on that award. I did see that on your website. That is amazing. Again, that could be a whole nother conversation, I think. But, so we're going to get into a little more technical stuff as well in this episode. Are you able to give us a little bit of background on your technical expertise? Is that something that you studied? Is that something that you picked up along the way? Is it self-taught? Where's your background as far as that goes?
Yeah, so music to me has always been a big part of my life, but another big part of my life has always been science, and that goes from a really young age, wanting to be an archaeologist. I'm sure there's a lot of people who feel the same way when they're a kid, being interested. You watch Eyewitness, you watch History Channel, whatever it might be. I had a lot of those influences growing up, between my dad, who was a microbiologist and studied psychology of music, and a lot of other related fields. And my grandmother was an amateur naturalist, was super into all things science. So, my grandfather, my mom's side, was an engineer. There was basically a lot of science present in my life growing up. So when I wasn't thinking about being a musician, I was thinking about being a scientist. And what I quickly kind of figured out in my early teens was that I really loved doing science, but I didn't have a brain for school particularly. So I did a lot of things on my own. I built, robots and did stuff with First Robotics, which was a fantastic program for homeschoolers in our state here in New Hampshire. The Segway founder, Dean Kamen, this was his stomping ground. So he pumped a lot of money into getting kids into doing science. And that's what, kind of eventually led to things like the Mars rover projects and stuff like that, getting young people into this kind of stuff. So from a young age, I was always side loading, science with the music. And then step forward to, quite a few years later, of having spent many years performing on stage, doing our own sound. We're a small act. My dad and I are often an act, which is just a duo, and we have 4 or 5 bands that we play with, and I often defaulted to becoming the sound engineer. When you're, a kid, what can you do, right? So I either have a noisemaker, I'm doing percussion on stage, in the case of the spoons that I mentioned with Dudley, or I'd be the sound person, right? So growing up doing sound kind of just in that environment, I felt fairly familiar with it, much like growing up listening to the tunes. I had them sort of in my head. You get a lot of instincts for how to deal with sound scenarios and what sounds good, what works, and also what facilitates making the music enjoyable to people. What do you need for people to not think about the sound? Sound is something that we don't think about a lot when it's working, but we do think about a lot when it isn't working.
Yes.
This being an audio only format, I'm sure you can recognize that. So I got really into the idea of that, just kind of the notion of microphones and things. And when I was maybe 17 or 18, I decided to start kind of an independent freelance recording situation. There's not a particular thing I would describe it as, but I collected some microphones, some good recording gear, and some good video gear. sidecar that with that. I had an interest in photography and video. And I started reaching out to folks and seeing if they wanted, video and audio, because there's people, when you see an act, a good YouTube video, or you see a good music video or something, it leaves you with something. And I felt that I wanted to bring that to a wider audience of people in the folk scene, because there's not a ton of resources. Not a lot of people in folk music have the time or the money to focus on sound. So seeing that impact that I was seeing in other genres of music, I kind of wanted to bring that to traditional music. So I started that. And then that leads finally into sort of the era that I'm in now, which I would say was driven largely in part. I got a 3D printer when I was about
Nice.
2017, and I saw the magic come to life with the Star Trek reality. And yeah, so got a 3D printer and needed my own sound. I wanted to get a better stage sound for myself. And I went to an amazing event called Folk Alliance International, which is again, something I could talk at length about, but is a big meeting of industry professionals, managers, musicians, and it's basically a giant networking event. And we found a company called Your Heaven Audio there that was like a brand new startup, and they claimed a lot of pretty miraculous things about their audio technology, which many people hear all the time. You hear magic cures to things, the as seen on TV factor. But I was fairly, I was curious. So we went, and this little story is worth it. The inception of this, I walked into their room, and it was Bruce Molsky, the old time fiddler, and he was playing in the corner of this conference hall. You can imagine there's 200 or 300 people in this hall. It's cacophony. We have Bose, the other audio company, near us with their speakers. They're blasting stuff. We on the other side flanking was a drum company, also making just a cacophony of racket. And I sat down, and I saw that Bruce was playing in this corner with this little. He had a fiddle and a little microphone in the fiddle and a pair of headphones on. And without saying anything, the owner of the company, who's now my boss, came up and handed me a pair of headphones. And I put them on, and all I could hear was his fiddle, and it sounded like it was in a studio or something. So that to me, that took my breath away as somebody who was interested in this kind of thing. And I bought their 2 floor units, and yeah, after some modifications and things with my 3D printing, yeah, I sent them some of my ideas, and they hired me pretty quickly. So,
That's
but
amazing.
yeah, it's sometimes it's the wow factor.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, wow. Um, so let's dig into you've said a lot of things here that I think we should probably dig into a little bit. Let's just start with a very broad thing. In the folk scenes, what are some of the challenges when it comes to audio?
Yeah. So in folk music, when it comes to audio and performance, I like to take a step back when I think about it and think about sort of the history of acoustics and why instruments are the way they are. Fiddles, guitars, things like this are hundreds and hundreds of years old. I mean, violins have been around for forever and ever, it seems like. But then in the grand scheme of things, there's been things like bagpipes, woodwinds. They've been around for even longer, or add zeros to that number, right? So, a great example of this is amphitheaters. If you've ever gone to an outdoor venue, think something like Red Rocks, or the Romans or the Greeks, where they'll have, a bowl set for musicians or theater performers or whoever it might be, spoken word, to play. And the whole purpose of them is to facilitate being able to see and hear what they're doing. And to think that they were thinking about that, 5, 10, 20,000 years ago.
Audio
They were thinking about
engineers, man.
those are the early audio engineers. They may not have had microphones or electricity, but the concept was there, right? So, um, they've been working on this kind of thing forever. Humans have been trying to make what I would say is rooms that sound good is the all encompassing way of describing it. And that sort of moved to me this needle in my head that I realized about instruments being, and this is something my boss at my company has a really some choice things about. Instruments are really sort of rooms as well. And when I think about folk musicians, we are always playing in particular types of venues more than often. We're playing in a house, we're playing in a church, we're playing in a Grange hall or something. These venues that were made for acoustic music. And that's because they come from an era where the music was these instruments that are made to be played in developed spaces and things. So when you talk about that whole narrative, there's nowhere in there are there microphones. Nowhere,
Right.
no, nowhere in that
Right.
equation is there amplification as we know it today. Speakers, cables,
In fact,
doodads, right? So
I think many of those people in those environments have like resistance towards amplification, like it's taking away.
absolutely, yeah. And there's a big emphasis that I see in my work on what I call acoustic transparency, which is the idea of what can we do to facilitate a musician on stage being, as impactful as possible to their audience. And this is an area of study that my dad also did quite a lot of research in with music psychology. His thesis in school was the idea that if a musician is looking at you in the eyes when they're playing rather than, looking off into the aether, that you register their music more. And a similar thing can be said about the way that it sounds. The better that you can hear somebody, the better, you can see someone's playing. If I go and watch a musician on stage and they're blocked out by a dozen microphone stands, well, number one, as a photographer, I'm frustrated by that. But
You're
number
right.
two, you may not be able to see their face or get their expressions or pick up the nuances of their playing as easily. So forever and ever, we've been working on acoustic transparency. What can we do to cut down on the things that you see on stage? And that goes very much hand in hand with how annoying it is to do something. So the annoyance factor is one that I think is a big one with folk musicians. We want to focus on our music. We don't want to focus on cables. We don't want to focus on, do I have enough for this or that plugged in? Can I hear this or that? Simplicity takes the reins 95% of the time. So yeah, my whole amplification, ethos in the last few years has been, what can I do for either myself on stage or people that come to my own studio or people that use my microphone systems to make it easier for them to play on stage and not think about it as much and focus down on the music they're trying to make as accurately as possible.
Yeah. So do you tend to do this by eliminating um like the number of things on the stage or by changing the focus of like the directionality of the microphones out? Like I know this is like, hey, can you just describe physics to me in a word? But
Yeah, yeah.
in an accessible way as you can, like what does that look like on the stage? Are you taking away um cables? Please say you're taking away cables, but also then you
Yeah.
get into Bluetooth, which is also annoying.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you can see, I mean, you can run with this because it's one of these things that, we think of wireless, we think of cables, we think of how many things are on stage. I An example I like to think back on is early recording and bluegrass, for instance, as a reference point. Even today, bluegrass, if you watch somebody who's on stage doing this type of music, often they have a single microphone. They'll have a mic in the center of the stage, often a beautiful looking mic, used as sort of a centerpiece. And that facilitates the sound. It looks good. But what it also does is it forces you into a box that is
Hmm.
working around that microphone and being hyper aware of where you are in relationship to the mic. So all these things come down to the style. So bluegrass music, that it facilitates that. You're using acoustic instruments, so
Hmm.
they're meant to be heard at distance. So violins, fiddles, banjos. I mean, talk about modern banjos with resonators. They are meant to be as loud as possible. I mean, that's the reason the resonator is there to be loud. In the 1920s, you didn't have mics very often, and you were relying heavily on, are my instruments loud enough? And if I'm the loudest band, I might get the gig, right?
Right.
So when it comes to bluegrass, the idea was that here we have this, what is essentially an acoustic thing, but bluegrass being a fairly modern invention, what can we do to bring it in? Well, we add a mic into the stage. And so it was already a lot to a lot of folks. Oh, we have a microphone. Or why, crazy. And so, but the idea is that the musicians got to be really thinking about it. It's solo music. You play, you have backup musicians, but really you're going around in a circle and people are soloing. And if you've ever watched the bluegrass musicians on stage, they'll move in and out. They'll duck in and out towards the mic in order to sound, to come bring the dynamics forward so that you can be heard and to create that sort of soundscape that we think of as a kind of a polished sound. And that extended as well to early recordings. So wax cylinder, wire recordings, even vinyl, up to a certain point. You were pressed if you had more than one microphone. I mean, with wax cylinder, you had a cone, you had a giant, 10-foot long Victrola cone looking thing. And you had to put every single musician behind it. And the end of that might only be a foot wide, right? So how do you do that? Well, some careful choreography and a lot of sidestepping, right? So,
Right.
we are at a place now where we have the ability to have 20 microphones on stage, but do you need 20 microphones on stage? The answer is probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah, so I'm always looking to strip things away. And in my own setup, I'll just to put my own kind of journey where I'm at right now, I just built all of my gear into a single case. So now I have a single case, and I have a luxury that I'm an engineer and I know how to do these sorts of things. But having a case that I don't have to think about much. I have one cable in and one cable out. That's sort of my nirvana. There's a whole lot of junk behind the scenes in that to make it work, but bringing that same mentality to stage when I do live sound or recording is a big part of my own sound reinforcement.
Yeah. Wow. This is so interesting. As you're speaking, I'm thinking of, for example, bluegrass concerts I've been to. And I'm like, wow, I figured they were being showy, like showcasing the soloist, but there was also that audio component there. And then I'm also thinking about, I do contra dance. I've been doing that since I was 8. It's my happy place. And I know that sound is always the big thing. You go to any of these big dance weekends, and the sound guy gets like more applause than anyone else because it's complicated to take. And I'm just thinking about this now that with everything you've been saying. So you've got a super resonant instrument designed to project. You've got a super resonant hall designed to bounce that sound around. But then you have, in the case of a contra dance community, you have like 200, 400 people, bodies absorbing that sound. So then you still need to amplify. There's just really a lot going on. So at what scale are these, like what these devices and these things that you're talking about right now, like where on the scale from like someone's living room up to those large dance weekends, like the Folk Life Festival in Seattle just happened, 800 people on the floor, outdoor area. So you're like super resonant on the one side and then it's outdoors, so where's the scale kind of that we're talking about here?
So I think for me, whenever I think about when someone comes to me and asks me like, what kind of gear am I going to need? And of course the question can be as simple as, well, I want to be heard on stage, right? And what do I need to be heard on stage? I think really fundamentally about, the simple stuff. What are you playing in an instrument? Do you want to sound like your instrument sounds? Or are you trying to run a pedal board with 100 things? There's this discussion we talk about in folk music and traditional music between sounding authentic, or sounding the way that you want to hear it in your head, right? And there's a healthy medium for a lot of folks, but some people really just want to hear their instrument louder. And so the approach to making your instrument just louder can be quite a bit different, and often even harder than making it sound, approachable, but maybe different in how you hear in your head or effects and that sort of thing. So, one of the big things I think about is like the type of locations you're playing, and isolation and things like that. One of the major issues you have with microphones is picking up more than you want, right? So we are always talking about how do we have the best quality sound? How do I have, if you get into the technical side of things, everyone's searching what is the best microphone? What is the best preamp? The list goes on, and people spend billions of dollars at this point trying to achieve this. But the kind of the fundamental to me is what are you trying to sound like, and are you picking up what you intend to pick up? So violins and other acoustic instruments like that, they project, they make a lot of sound. They make a sphere of sound that comes from the front of the instrument or the top of the instrument in the case of like a violin. And in say like you're talking about a concert hall, or a venue like you mentioned, a contra dance or something like that. There's a lot of noise, right? There's noise from the people having a great time. There's noise from your cohort to your left and right that are probably also playing fairly loud instruments. And so we talk about isolation being a really important part of this. There's two really different acoustic environments sort of that I like to think about. There's like the most controlled environment, which is a studio, and they've spent thousands of dollars on sound absorption to stop unnoticed, or very noticeable, I should say, reflections and things like that. If you ever gone into a parking garage and clapped your hands or yelled real loud, or even your shower, you're hearing all these reverberations, and you may not want those, right? So that is a perfect environment. You're in a studio, it's controlled. Then we talk about the exact opposite. You're in a big hall. There's tons of stuff happening. And it comes down to focus. So I like to think the very nicest sound often you can get is in a room that you can control, because you can capture the room. And that's just where I come back to my point of instruments being a room and the room being a room. And the same way, speakers are microphones and vice versa. So, this is a particular one, but I'm sure a few people will resonate this. If you have a violin on stage and it's real loud, and say you have a pickup in that instrument and you got monitors and there's other things happening, the top of your violin becomes a microphone, and you start hearing extraneous noise coming through the top of your instrument back into your sound, and going out. And that's the most extreme example, right? You hear electric guitar is the same way. If you take an electric guitar and you put it in a loud enough room, you'll start to hear things in the room through the guitar. So I often think, like, what is the how loud are you? We have the Burren, this venue in Boston, that's known as an Irish arts kind of almost a time capsule, you could say. And one of the mainstays about this venue is it's real freaking loud in there. It's deafening. You go in, I have earplugs in the moment I step in that building. And my sound scenario in there is as narrow as it can be. I need the very, very, most pointed. I just need to be able to hear the instrument. I can't pick up anything. Microphones almost go out the window when you talk about a venue like that. And the company that I work for, that has been my test. Can I run our system with microphones in there and actually have it be, not picking up the, Joe Schmo sitting at the bar yelling about, the last pint he just drank. And then the exact opposite being in my home studio here, somewhere like that. I go down into my my studio. I have microphones that their entire purpose is just to pick up the sound of the room. They're picking up as much sound as possible, right? So you got to know your environment, know the instruments you're working with, and most importantly, know the musicians, what they want, and understand that everyone's sound, what they hear in their head or what they want to hear in their head, is so different. And there's no one size, one shoe fit all kind of situation. You can get the best microphone in the world in the wrong scenario, and it's gonna sound bad.
As you can hear, there are about 1,000 things I could talk about with Brennish on this podcast. It took a while of us going back and forth to settle on this topic, but I think it's super interesting because you don't hear much about the challenges of audio in the folk scene. Back in episode 22, I interviewed Bridget Hawley, an audio engineer who does software. I learned so much about how music happens in the digital space, and if you're enjoying this episode, you might want to go back and listen to episode 22. One of the things Bridget mentioned was the limitations of hardware. I love how Brennish is working on that side of the puzzle, and Bridget is working on a slightly different but tangentially related side of the puzzle, and all of it is geared towards people having a good listening experience. If you want to hear my thoughts about this, head over to zeitgeistacademy.com/radio and sign up for my newsletter. That's ZEITGEIST academy.com/radio. I think the other thing that plays into this, if you haven't played in an amplified setting before, you may not realize how important it is to be able to hear there's the mix that the audience hears, but then there's the mix that you hear through your own monitors, not just being able to hear yourself, but being able to hear your bandmates at a level where you can kind of keep track of what, how everybody's doing. You're playing together. If someone starts to run away with it, because I've been on stages where someone has started to run away with it because they don't hear us or vice versa. So where in this acoustic world, again, it's very, very different, I'm sure, depending on the situation. But do you manage that sort of thing as well, like not just projecting for the audience, but also the monitors reflecting back to the musicians?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I think about an awful lot being a recording guy, right? So being somebody who does recorded music, often where you do multi-track. So the invention of multi-track is fairly new. We're talking 1970s, 1980s. and maybe earlier than 1960s. But the notion that you can just hit a button and record two things at the same time is great, but only if you can hear the thing you just recorded well. So I'm always thinking about monitoring and headphones and being able to hear monitors on stage. I think about if I go back in time again to my sort of my Roman analogy. There's the idea that there's the audio that the participants outside of the audience basically can hear. That's projected audio, and that's really important. That needs to sound. That's your final product, right? That needs to be sort of the not sterile. It needs to be lively. It needs to be dynamic. And that side of things had a lot of facilitation as far as the shape of the room and having there's this history of things like Helmholtz resonators. There's a lot of nerdy stuff here, but devices essentially to make the sound coming off of a stage as rich as possible for the audience. Now, the opposite end of that is the musicians or the performers being able to hear each other, and often that is sterile and is picked apart from necessarily what the audience is hearing. So, in a modern scenario like this, on stage, you might have monitor wedges or something like this that are speakers placed on the floor that are delivering you a custom mix. That's say I need to hear a bit more of the guitar player. You'd always see people in sound checks going, putting their thumbs up, thumbs down, saying, "Hey, I need to hear more of this or that or less of this or that." And that's what will, really drives a good performance in a modern scenario. Now, there are plenty of venues that have perfect acoustics. This is a thing that exists, and I've played them, and sometimes it's the last place you'd expect. I remember I played a Rotary Club once that had they had a divider wall hanging from the ceiling, and it was in the perfect spot, and I could hear everything. It was some of the best playing that I had ever. With my own father. I think there's a real focus that I myself see a need for in building locations that are good to play in as the musicians, and where you don't necessarily need things like monitors. The more that you can do that yourself, the better. There's another great example of this. There's a festival I go to in California up in the high Sierras, and this festival is known for acoustic music only. And what I mean by that is that we don't just play music that is meant for acoustic instruments. We will also take music that is meant for electric instruments and bring it to an acoustic volume on purpose. And so that it forces people to be quiet. It forces people to listen, to sit there and listen to some of this stuff. And they want to listen, for the record. But we have these beautiful venues there where a lot of time and care has been spent to make it a joy to play on those stages. And whether that be, angled ceilings or tapestries to give the bounce sound back at the musicians. We have these venues called bus stops that look like a bus stop, but the top of it is angled in such a way so the sound hits it, comes back to you in a nice amount of time. So it makes the sound much bigger than it is with these little tiny venues, but the sound sounds humongous when you're sitting in them. And a lot of care has been put into that, and it's not the kind of thing that's readily obvious, right? So that's sort of the acoustic side of it. And now I'd say the real modern side of it that I'm getting into a lot comes from this need for longevity. And what I mean by that is there's the medical issue that comes from playing music, and then that is hearing damage, right? And it's kind of an obvious one. Tinnitus plagues a lot of musicians, certainly plagues a lot of rock and metal and hardcore, that kind of thing, where you have loud drums, you have loud bass, things like that. And I meet so many of these guys who are, in their early 20s, mid 20s that have, irreversible hearing damage from playing in loud gigs. So I personally, I have a vested interest in wanting my friends and my peers and myself to be able to keep using our ears as long as possible. So a lot of people in at this point are switching to in-ear monitors, and the idea they're just basically fancy, Apple earbuds or something like that. But with the focus being isolation, so they act as earplugs as well. They stop all that external noise coming in. And then the internal, the sound quality is good, and you can have the volume levels that are reasonable rather than stacking volume. So monitors, when you have a monitor on stage, you run into all sorts of problems. Number one, Say you have loud instruments, you got to crank those monitors above the instrument level. Say you got a big, audience that's cheering and whooping and hollering. Again, those monitors are going up in volume, right? And you're just creating more and more and more damage every time you add another layer to that. So, having monitoring and being able to hear yourself on stage as quietly as possible, I think is one of my personal interests avoiding, how long can we play this music? If I can't hear when I'm 65 years old, how am I going to play? So
Yeah. And in the folk community, 65 is young.
yeah, exactly.
I love it. I could ask you a million questions about what you just said, but let's move along. And there's a question. There's a term I would like you to define, if you don't mind. What is live sound engineering?
So live sound engineering is creating worthwhile sound in a live environment, a non-controlled environment. That means reacting to things around you, working with venues, working with, hey, somebody needs a microphone to make an announcement. It's something as simple as that. Something as complex as, hey, I have a giant metal boxy room and I need to use my engineering skills and the academic side of things to produce an accurate sound in a big, giant, reverberant room, right? So it's almost like being an audio handyman. And what I mean by that is, when you are working in your own environment, you're working in a studio and you're an audio engineer, there's a lot of variables, but many of them are totally controllable. And so being a live sound audio engineer means you're working with many variables outside of your own control. And it means sort of having everything you would have as a recording engineer and more, right? You also need to understand stage times and stage management and musicians. You have to understand musicians. How if somebody goes, I to hell with that microphone, I'm not going to deal with this, that, or or a piece of gear malfunctioning. All that comes down to you as the live engineer facilitating the musicians on stage. All engineering, as far as audio goes, in my opinion, comes down to how much of the barrier of entry can we knock down. We want a clean road, to that sound that we're hearing, and you don't want to have roadblocks in the way. And so, being an audio engineer is a jack of all trades, is the way I describe it.
And I think a lot of communities, and again, I'm only speaking to the ones that I know of, but just an observation that I've made is this is a role that nobody really wants to do, but it's also super, super important. And I think a lot of people are intimidated. They see the soundboard and it's got all of these buttons and dials and sliders. But do you have any thoughts to share or words of advice if someone is in a community, sees that, for example, it's the one same guy that's been doing sound for the past 40 years and there is no backup for people who would like these communities to continue? What are some pieces that you would maybe just advise for people who see that need or maybe thinking about it and mildly interested but still intimidated?
Yeah, I mean, it is a dying breed. I think you hit the nail right on the head there. Audio engineering is, in one sense, gotten a lot more accessible. So
Yeah.
it's a lot easier these days to just become your own engineer. Getting both when that comes down to recording and having a home studio, much easier now. Also, live sound's a lot easier now. Equipment's just cheaper. And we've moved away from custom British or engineered giant $500,000 consoles that only like two people in the world now to use. Now you can have a lot of those same features just right in your desktop for a couple $100. So there's sort of that side of things where it's become more abundant. But on the other side of the real technical side of things, you're right. There's a lot less interest in it, and a lot of that comes down to the time investment. It's a lot of time to learn how to do this stuff. And I think if I was going to frame it, one of the things that I think about a lot is that as a sound engineer, my goal is to make the music as good as I can. And if you think of it from a technical point of view, how can I make it sound the very cleanest? Or, we use words like warm and clean and transparent, things like that. You get bored kind of quick, even if you're you're really in the weeds with it. Getting into the technical side of things, I think, is a personal interest and an interest that a lot of people have that are nerdy and are into that kind of thing. But I often like to think about this, especially when talking to younger people and trying to get people into this kind of thing, that what we really need to do, we need people that want to make the music good. We want
Yeah.
people to be heard, right? So, and it's just a means to an end. And something like live sound, I think about in our communities, there's plenty of need for live sound that's not as high stakes as, running the board for the Rolling Stones or something, right? When we think about you're in a big concert, you are mission control. You are NASA piloting the giant rocket that's trying to land on the moon and not, crash and kill the whole band that's trying to get through their set, right? So that's a real crazy thing. But the more approachable thing is like, hey, we have a town hall or we got a church or we got a meeting place. People want to be heard. And I know that I found a lot of my initial knowledge and things, and even now I do this a lot through those types of venues, going and helping people facilitate their needs. So we talk about somebody. We have a local a couple churches that want to they want to get sound to their parishioners and things, or they have a couple of UU churches too that do dances and things here. And they're really just looking to make their events as good as they possibly can. They don't want to be thinking about the technical side of things, and they're often very forgiving because they don't know a lot. If you're doing this kind of stuff, say you're a pastor or something, you may not know a lot, or say you're a local band or a bar or something. You're not thinking about the sound much. So I like to reach out and get those types of gigs. Those are great ones to start with. Find a local venues that just need somebody, because like not every place has got the guy who's been working there, or maybe the guy who's been working there 50 years wants somebody to talk to about all the stuff he's doing and wants a little bit of help. So it's definitely a somewhat guarded profession, but at the same time, people in this industry really appreciate when you're into what they do, and it's so necessary that I think it's a worthwhile thing to dive into.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I guarantee if you go to a local contra dance and you tell them that you are interested in sound, they will mentor you every single dance
Yep,
until you
yep.
are
Even if it's just pulling
competent.
cable.
Even if it's
Yep.
that's yep. Even if it's just setting up and tearing down, there's a lot of moving pieces. Thank you. Can you describe some of these microphone systems that you've designed for these acoustic rooms and areas?
Yeah, sure. So, when I came and found the company I work for, Your Heaven Audio, back at Folk Alliance, my need at the time was I wanted a transparent system for my violin. I take a lot of care in my own sound and trying to acoustically play what I'm hearing in my head. And I'm somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of gear often when I play on stage, in the sense that I have a lot of junk, but I don't, my sound is fairly authentic to the natural instrument sound.
Yeah, can
Um,
you describe really quick before you keep going what you mean by transparent?
yeah, so um, acoustic instruments, especially things like violins, are meant to sound good from the start. Something like an electric guitar often has what they call a clean sound, which is the sound right out of the guitar. But then you're augmenting it. So you're running it through pedals. You have distortions and you have reverbs and delays and all these, technical terms that basically describe just things, effects that change the sound, right? And that might also go into an amp and go into et cetera, right? So if we go back to acoustic instruments like violins and guitars and things like this, they have this already fantastic sound right to start with, because someone has spent an unbelievable amount of time coming up with this beautiful shape that produces sound accurately. I mean, there's a reason if you look at almost any violin in the world, if it's not a modern design, probably has a fake Guarneri or a fake Stradivarius sticker in it, right? And that's because there's sort of that golden sound. So rather than take what's broken and try to fix it, I was looking for transparency. I wanted it to sound, I want my violin to sound like my violin. I spent time and money and plenty years of practice to sound the way that I do. And I'm not trying to throw that off by putting something crummy into my instrument. So a problem that I see all the time with music is people that have beautiful playing and beautiful musicians, beautiful instruments and et cetera, et cetera, but they have a system that almost mischaracterizes their music, in the sense it's not authentic to maybe they like it, it's authentic to what they hear. But a lot of acoustic musicians, I see this where they have a beautiful instrument and it sounds fantastic if you hear it in a small venue where you can actually hear it. But as soon as you run it through a PA, you lose the nuances of it. So when I approached my own personal amplification, I wanted something that was as accurate of a reproduction of my own instrument sound as possible. So this system that we've designed here at Your Heaven is exactly that. The whole idea and notion of it is that it actually takes almost an imprint of what your instrument sounds like when you first set it up, and that is what it uses to take the sound that it's actually gathering and reproduce it. It's taking it and cross-referencing that with, well, here's what this violin is meant to be sound like in a room, right? So it was a simple notion, but real genius, and that came from our founder, so Steve Schwartz, who's the founder of Your Heaven Audio. He grew up in Providence, and his family owned a mill below Audio-Technica's laboratories. And so when he was a kid, he would go into the mill and he would play. He was very, knack for mechanical things, and he'd be up messing around. And they realized that at a pretty young age. These smart guys let him come and screw around in their labs. And what he eventually kind of, long story short, led to the idea that you can make whole room microphones, whole room speakers. So things called transducers, where it's like a puck and you attach it to a surface, and you can make a wall into a speaker, or a chair, or any object. You can sort of turn them into speakers. And the same thing with rooms. You can take a room and make it into a microphone. A room is just a big fiddle when you really think about it. It's maybe not as meticulously designed as a violin, but it's a big chamber. Air moves in and out of it somehow, unless it's completely sealed. And if you can control that, you can control the sound. And if you can learn what a room, in quotes here, looks like sonically, you can often change that to sound more like you want. So the notion was that if he could do room correction, essentially make speakers sound better in a room with some fancy math, maybe that would work for instruments too. So he took that same notion, just a very flat microphone in an instrument, and with some fancy math, you can take what is maybe a bad sounding signal, which is sticking a mic right on an instrument. If you've ever used a microphone and stuck it, maybe in your ear. Your ear is a mic in this case. You stick your ear right on a fiddle and you play some loud stuff. It's going to sound like a saw being driven across your ear. So, but taking that, there's a lot of good information there, right? It just needs to develop, and that develop. The developing sound is something that you can actually keep track of with a lot of math. So, we make systems that are just trying to make, if you have a $5,000 guitar, it's going to sound like your $5,000 guitar. But if you have a $10 guitar you got at a flea market somewhere, it's going to sound like the $5 guitar you got at a flea market, which is what we want, right? Transparency.
Right. My brain is exploding from so many things in that. This is awesome. This is such an interesting way to think about sound. I have never thought about things that way before. So in some sense, the room, yes, as far as being a choral singer, and resonance is obviously an important part in choral singing, especially a cappella. So understanding the room is part of the instrument, like that makes sense to me. But there were so many other things. So you're taking these. So in the example of you playing your violin, are you saying that your microphone, like you put it directly on? Is it like sticky? You wouldn't want to put something sticky, or does it clamp on?
Yeah. Well, so this is a great question, because this is actually what I personally do at the company. So I came to the company having bought their systems on the show floor and being very happy with the sound. And the other side of that is what we talked about earlier. What is transparent as far as visual and being, when you're on stage, what is easy, what facilitates making music. So I found that there were complications in the mechanics of it, how the mics went on the instruments, how cabling worked, that sort of stuff, the fixtures, the physical hardware that actually interfaces with your instrument. So I modified some of that stuff, and that was what ultimately got me the job there. And so now my technical title is I'm an R&D specialist, but focusing on performance. So I design fixtures, I design connectors, and that sort of thing. So the mics of the violin system, it's pretty simple. The mic goes actually in the little F hole on the instrument, and the connection is terminated on the back of the violin with a tiny little connector and some rubber straps to keep everything so the instrument's safe. There's nothing permanent, and there's nothing that can damage the instrument. So that's a big part of my own work too. Here is there's a lot of folks that have instruments that they don't want to damage. They don't want to,
Hmm.
add in. You talk about sticky stuff. We don't want to glue. We don't want to screw. We don't want to do anything like that. We don't want to permanently modify our instruments. And guitar players are often used to that with guitar systems we've had for years to drill into the bridge and make new saddles and make jack ends on the side of the guitar. My own personal guitar being no exception to this. I have two separate jacks on the side of my instrument and probably 3 pounds of gear in that instrument. But the idea is with all these things, we want to design microphone systems that didn't require modification. So that has been an incredibly difficult task. How do how do we replace what has been traditional means of doing things? If you've seen any violin pickup system in the last 50 years, they typically have a big clamp that goes on the side of the instrument that you plug a jack in. And that while that's reliable, it doesn't facilitate the sound. It looks strange. You certainly don't want to leave something like that on a priceless instrument for too long because you're going to cause issues. And there's a lot of reasons for this type of thing. And to say that they came up with a good design originally is accurate. I mean, that's a usable thing, right? So, but reinventing the wheel in a way that doesn't tread over usability, but still facilitates, using it on stage and not having it break. These are complicated tasks that I've approached from a very modern standpoint with 3D printing and laser cutting and a lot of emergent technologies to try to bring it to a modern place. Violins were cutting edge when they came out, right? So we can bring some nuance and some technology into the side of things now.
Yeah. What types of instruments do you design for?
So we primarily design things for instruments that I would call roomable instruments. So I was talking about the idea of miking rooms and whole room transducers and things. So similarly, a violin, a guitar, cello, bass, those types of instruments. For sure, banjos have been something that we're working on now too. We talk about an open back banjo. It doesn't sort of like a room. It's a room without a ceiling, right? You have an open back, but when it's against your body, now you have a room, right? So these types of things, any instrument that is like that, we've designed for. So we've even made drum. A drum is a big room. We've made piano. A piano is a beautiful room, right? And a real costly room. You want to accurately reproduce sound in. And we're expanding to other things now, but we've worked with all sorts of stuff. So just an hour before this interview here, I was working on a mic system for a double neck guitar. Someone in Brazil who has just the wildest looking thing you've ever seen, and most traditional systems just won't even approach accurately reproducing its sound. So for us, this has sort of been our the cream of our crop. We love building these little custom things. We even had something as extreme as a glass harmonium. How on earth do you mic a glass harmonium? Well,
Oh, wow.
we figured it out. So, yeah, we like a challenge.
Oh, this is so fun. So let's take a step back here into the shoes of some of us who may not understand. We've learned a lot today, but then we go forth into the world. If I enter an acoustic setting, or if someone listening enters an acoustic setting, what are some things that people can look for, just to make a more, educated, like you look at the room and you just kind of to know what's going on a little bit more in a way that you didn't before? What are some things that people can look for, especially likely there will be some kind of live sound engineering going on. But what are some things that you think the average person, it would be cool if they were noticing?
Yeah, so from my perspective as someone who's done sound for people, but who I've also been, the musician on stage, trying to work with an engineer who's trying to communicate things. The main thing I think is verbiage. There's a lot of verbiage related to live sound that folks just don't know, and I don't necessarily expect them to, but a little goes a long way. Knowing things like gain and the idea of volume. It goes a tremendous distance. When we're talking about there's the nerdy technical side of audio is making sure you have enough of a signal where you want the signal and not where you don't want it, right? So being able to explain to your engineer, I want more of this or less of that, it goes a huge distance. And less is more in a lot of cases with this type of thing. I think a lot fundamentally when I get to any gig, my first thought is, well, what looks good? And I go back to those principles of, the amphitheater, the idea that if I'm playing in a spot that's going to push my sound out naturally, that is going to do a lot towards my own, my sound on stage as much as any microphone or any speaker will, right? So, I'm lucky to be blessed. I play in a lot of venues that have pretty darn good acoustics. But there's certainly the gigs you get where you're playing in a big box with carpets and low floors and the whole thing. And then at that point, then you're coming down to, yeah, do we have the focused sound? Do we have mics that are not going to pick up the extraneous stuff? And knowing things about like feedback. If you push a mic too hard, and you have your speakers close to it, you're going to feed back. Knowing that, their room again is a big instrument. So when you play audio into a room, you have a PA and you're making noise, you're exciting everything in that room. If you have a room with metal walls and a low ceiling, you're going to get lots of reverb and high frequency weird stuff. Say you're playing in a room, it's a big theater, it resonates like crazy, or a cathedral or something like this. I work with people who do choral singing, and other things like that. I've done organ work too in huge, huge rooms. And then it's the opposite problem. So now there's too much sound. There's a lot of a good thing. But how can we rein it back? So know your space. When I get into a space, and as long as there's not too many, eyes on me, I might clap real loud or make some hoops or hollers or something, right? Walk around the room. In audio recording, we think about it all the time, but in live recording, the same thing goes. If your instrument sounds good and if you walk around and you play it and you like the sound of it, chances are it might be the spot, and we can't always rely on, maybe the best sounding spot is the least aesthetically pleasing spot, but there's a balance there. And I think of all that way before I bring a mic, onto my stage. Yeah, and keeping things simple for your audio engineer. If I can have, the least amount of things that I have to hand to him and have him know, if you know simple terms like, do I need a DI? Do I have mic level signals? Do I have line level signals? Even just things like, what is my cable? Do I have a 1/4 inch cable or an XLR or something like that? There's a whole lot of things in the audio world, but the stuff you end up using on stage, there's not a huge amount of technical jargon you need to know, but the fundamentals really help, and your audio engineer will thank you tremendously.
And I can tell everyone that if I can learn all of that stuff, you absolutely can learn all of that stuff. Awesome. Well, I could obviously pick your brain for so much longer, but we do wrap it up. I asked every guest the same question at the end, because I think ultimately making music is all about bringing things to life, right? So I'm going to ask you, what was a recent or memorable zeitgeist moment for you? Zeitgeist means spirit of the times. And basically that's a term I've coined in lack of knowing any other term for that moment where you're making music and you just hit that, you plug into something bigger than yourself, and think like the scene or the music or something about it just comes alive for you. And I think that's the moment we all seek as musicians. It's the moment we seek as people who go to see live music, or people who are in any point facilitating that connection of making music. I'll give you an example of one of mine. So I grew up in Montana, and I also come from a family of musicians, been making music since the womb, basically. and absolutely some of the most magical moments in my life, zeitgeist moments, where we're around a campfire making music on acoustic instruments, with the beautiful stars of just the sky just spread out above you. There's little light pollution out there in the mountains, and you're just out there playing around a fire. Someone's singing, the coals have kind of gone down, and everyone's, maybe there was a rockin' party earlier. That's also very fun. But now they kind of hit this calm, and you got some folks noodling on guitars. You've got maybe a vocals, just kind of whatever people bring, these acoustic instruments. And that to me is one of the absolute most magical things that you can do in music, is is reach that point in the night where there's
Absolutely.
yeah. So that's an example of what to me like a moment where music just like I plug into something higher than myself in that moment. But I would love to hear from you, Brennish. What is a recent or a memorable zeitgeist moment for you?
Yeah, so I really resonated a lot with what you just said. I have had many of those moments, luckily, throughout my life. I mean, I consider myself really blessed to have, have spent a lot of a time playing under the stars and around a fire, playing in someone's living room and having those kind of magical moments. I think of three or four that come to mind, but one that I think that stands out in particular, I had a moment last year where it's at the Clifftop Appalachian String Band Festival in West Virginia. So it's a big meeting of the minds. There's thousands of folks come down for 10 days of old time music. There's fiddle contests and dance contests and just square dancing in general, and a jam every 15 feet. That's one of the mainstays of this festival, right? So we had a moment where in the Blue Ridge Mountains, there's a lot of rain, very humid out there. We had a moment where we had kind of the things kind of came together. Somebody wanted to do a session with this person and this person. Everyone's always seeking each other out. As you imagine, you have 3 or 4 thousand people all running around. Everybody wants to play with everybody, and not everything happens, right? But there's these moments of serendipity where things kind of come together. So we had a kind of a meeting of 3 or 4 people, and we want to play, and each of us kind of went out and grabbed another person. And let's see if I can name everybody here. It was myself, or my friend Kate Gregory, Brendan Hearn. Let's see so we have a fiddle. I'm fiddle. Kate's fiddle. Brendan's a cello player. We had another 2 fantastic players, Alan and let's see here. Who else was it? It was Alan and it was M and Rachel Eddy, and who else was it? The Carrs, basically the Carr family, Jane and Alan Rothfield. I think that's everybody. Anyway, long story short, these are the people who know who what I'm talking about will know the combination of people that we've assembled here. But we had this group of musicians that spontaneously came together under a single tent. We were under, a closed wall tent, and the moment we stepped in, thunderstorm. Big thunderstorm, and talk about, being in the right place at the right time, though. Here we are trapped with some of our favorite people all in one spot. And we played for, I don't know, 5-7 hours or something straight. We didn't stop. We tuned our instruments to the same tuning, and we just played in this ethereal fiddle orchestra. It felt like something out of a dream. We could hear each other talk about acoustics. This tent had a beautiful dome top, right. Credit to Rachel and them. They spent the money and they got a beautiful tent. We could hear each other fantastically. It sounded like I was in a studio, and we all afterwards said, man, if only we had a mic running in the center of this room, it would have been a record right there. But that moment of sitting and you're confined, there's nothing else I can do. Nothing else I really want to do either, right? It's raining. I'm in this tent. We all know these same tunes. That's the beauty of traditional and folk music. We all know these tunes. And even when somebody suggested a tune that none of us knew, they're the perfect length to learn, right? And so we were able to. I learned 5 or 6 new tunes. Janie played some of her own tunes that we had never heard before that she had written. Again, short and sweet. We can learn these things pretty quick. And what you get there is just we all were one mind by the end of it, just beaming with joy. We came out of that session. I felt my heart was full for almost the whole summer. That gave me a kick to keep going, to keep pushing through. There's lots of craziness always happening in the world. But whenever I get to those moments of unrest, I think about things like we made that thing happen and we were just locked in. And those moments, I had another one in the Caribbean recently with a bunch of Irish musicians playing, they're totally different change of scenery, but still hot and humid. But everybody playing together and knowing the same tunes, and just that is something so magical about this kind of music, that we can play it together. There's common repertoire, and that it's far more than just the music. It's that it's yet another way for us to all connect together.
I love that so much. Brennish, thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Zeitgeist Radio. If you'd like to take the next step in your musical journey, head over to zeitgeistacademy.com/radio to join my newsletter. Seriously, it's fun and informative, and I never spam or sell your information. That's zeitgeistacademy.com/radio. Music for this episode was created by Ian Boswell. Please hit that subscribe button and tell all your friends you found a cool new podcast. See you next time.